Okay, to continue our discussion about meat production, we're going to compare what grain-fed and grass-fed meat production looks like. So the grain-fed is considered to be conventional beef production, and what people talk about as like a farm to fork model is the grass-fed model, where cows spend most of their life or all of their life eating grass out on pasture, like we think of as cattle operations. So in both places, a cow or calf producer breeds cattle and raises calves to weaning age. There's a stalker that raises the calves to larger weights on pasture. These backgrounding conditions are to get them ready for feed lots by feeding them grain gradually by increasing the amounts little bit by little bit. If they're grass-fed, they stay on grass their whole lives, just as you would expect, and go to a processor where they're slaughtered and cut into appropriate cuts of meat and distributed to the consumer. Smaller operations sometimes go through farmers markets, but many grocery stores carry grass-fed beef. So if you're going the grain-fed route, which is where most of U.S. beef comes from, so if you go get a steak in most restaurants, it's going to be grain-fed. If you go get a hamburger from a fast food restaurant, that's most likely to be grain-fed. So once they've gone through this thing called backgrounding, where they're slowly increasing the amount of grain in the calves' diets, preparing them to go on the feedlot, they're put on this feedlot where the animals are crowded in a confined area, and they don't have a lot of movement, and they're fed just lots of grain, mostly corn, to fatten them up. And then they go to a processor and a wholesaler and a retailer, so a grocery store and a consumer. And this is considered to be the conventional model. The retailer could be a restaurant chain or something like that too. It's important to note that meat production is very energy intensive. It takes at least 16 times more fossil fuels to produce a kilogram of meat than it does to produce a kilogram of plant material. And livestock do produce 20% of the world's emissions of greenhouse gases. So that is a large percentage. Animal production produces more greenhouse gases than the transportation industry. So we often blame cars, but cows really take a big part of the blame for the increase in greenhouse gases, which are causing climate change. And this is just this is a funny cartoon, but it's important to note that they're not really farting out methane. They're actually burping it out. So, but sheep do this as well. We just don't grow nearly as many sheep as we do cows. So I also wanted to talk about land. So land for growing livestock makes up a huge proportion of what land is used for in the lower 48 states of the United States. So what this map does is it takes all the parcels of land, excuse me, of the same use, and it pushes them together so you can kind of see how big it is relative to the size of the lower 48 of the United States. And so it's got everything on here. It's got it's got railroads, it's got airports, it's got different kinds of timberland, it's got your national parks up here, federal wilderness. If you move me out of the way, we see urban housing and urban commercial areas over here, rural housing. They've even got tobacco and flowers separated out here. But what you see takes up a huge amount of space is cow pasture and range. And this is often land that's not suitable for growing crops on. A lot of times we'll use as rangelands. And so a lot of land is going to cows, But what I think is even more interesting is that the amount of land we're growing crops on to feed livestock is much larger than the amount of land that we're using to grow food that we actually eat directly. So most of the time when you're driving around, you see, fields of corn is pretty common in a lot of different areas of the country, especially, in the Midwest up here. Most of that corn is going to feed cows. Some of it is definitely going to feed some other animals like chickens and pigs and things like that. But a lot of it is going to feed animals, and it's not going to feed us directly. Some of that is also being turned into corn syrup, which you can see has its own block. That's going into soda and cookies and things like that. That's an amazing amount of land for that. And you can see there's even the amount for barley beer and amount for maple syrup. So these are things that were big enough to actually fit somewhere. We do see that we export a lot of wheat, which is here. And then the other big portion of corn that's not going to feed cows is going towards ethanol production. So that's what this square is. So our farmland is not always, we think that it's for feeding us, but it's not always just for feeding us. Sometimes it's for feeding animals that will then eventually feed us, or it's going for fuel. So I wanted to point that out since cows take up such a huge amount of land in the United States. So another way that we get animal protein is from seafood. It is an important protein source, and it is the primary source of protein for about 1.5 billion people in developing countries. Since 1989, all major fisheries in the world have declined, and many are now commercially unsustainable. We have ramped up production so that we use really large boats to pull fish out of the ocean. We're pulling vast amounts out, and it's been predicted that if the practices continue as they are, that the world's fisheries will be exhausted by 2050, and that's coming up pretty quick. So the state of our fisheries and our oceans is currently rather alarming. And there's a lot of unintended consequences to the way this kind of industrial fishing that we've been doing lately. One important term is bycatch, and I talk about this in 212, so if you've already taken about that, you've heard about this before. But they're a lot of times putting huge nets and straining lots of water to pull in as many fish as possible. And often other things that are in the water get caught that we don't want to eat. So that could be seabirds that are trying to eat the fish that we're trying to harvest. It could be sea turtles, which you can see here. You get marine mammals sometimes, like dolphins. And sometimes it's just fish that we don't eat. And these are called bycatch, and a lot of times they get thrown back, and most of the time they don't make it. They've been sitting in a net for a long time, and then they get hauled on board to a big boat, and then they get dumped. And that's pretty traumatic and results in a lot of injuries, and a lot of them die. And so this is a picture, a very sad picture of sea turtles that were bycatch in a fishing operation. So the biggest way we get seafood is pulling it out of the ocean. Another way we get seafood is aquaculture. And this is basically growing aquatic species in enclosures, and it is providing an increasing share of the world's seafood. And I want to point out that there are many different ways of doing aquaculture, and it depends a lot on the species that you're talking about. A lot of times aquaculture that is the most sustainable is aquaculture that's done in tanks on land. So things like tilapia are often grown in big tanks on land, and it's easy to filter the water and make sure it's not harming other aquatic ecosystems in those setups. So tilapia tends to be better, and it's also a freshwater fish, so that's the other reason that it's usually grown in big tanks. A lot of marine aquaculture looks more like this, where there are enclosures that are floating in the ocean. And so water is passing from the ocean into the enclosures and out of the enclosures. And so a lot of times in these kinds of situations, they're using wild populations to stock and or feed the captive populations in these enclosures. Shrimp, a lot of the aquaculture for shrimp, so farmed shrimp, that's usually done in places like India and Southeast Asia, where they've destroyed mangrove forests or wetlands to put in these aquaculture operations. And it's very destructive, and it's not really good for the local communities either, because mangrove forests and wetlands are protecting those communities from cyclones and things like that, like hurricanes. And these are important ways to protect the coastline and keep them from losing land like we are in Louisiana. And so that's particularly destructive. And so shrimp is often done this. So choosing farmed shrimp is usually not the most sustainable option. Sometimes it facilitates the spread of disease to wild populations, as we talked about. Concentrating a bunch of individuals into a small space means that disease spreads really rapidly, and usually there are higher rates of disease. So in salmon operations, when they're farming salmon, a lot of times it looks something like this, and they've concentrated all the salmon, and there are salmon farms in the Pacific Northwest, and the native salmon are swimming right by them, and they're getting all these parasites and things that are in the water because of these salmon farms. And so that can be detrimental to our native salmon populations. It also releases large amounts of feces, antibiotics, and other pollutants from these that gets into ocean water, and that can be polluting. And a lot of times the benthic areas, the bottom areas at the bottom of the ocean underneath these enclosures, do not have the biodiversity or the function that normal ocean floor ecosystems have.